द्वितीयोऽध्यायः साङ्ख्ययोगः
Bhagavad Gita Chapter 2 Sankhya Yoga, Yoga of Knowledge.
यदा संहरते चायम् कूर्मोऽङ्गानीव सर्वशः इन्द्रियाणि इन्द्रियार्थेभ्य तस्य प्रज्ञा प्रतिष्ठिता.
2.58 When like the tortoise which withdraws its limbs on all sides, he withdraws his senses from the sense objects, then his wisdom becomes steady. So far a man of steady wisdom has been described as the one who a. is ever satisfied in the self, b. lives in perfect equanimity in pleasure and pain, and c. in whom there is complete lack of attachment for feelings of joy or aversion. Now it is mentioned in this verse that a man of steady wisdom has the capacity to withdraw his sense organs from the field of their objects, just like a tortoise can draw back its limbs from all sides within its shell when apprehending danger. The sense organs receive the stimuli from the objects of the external world, which are passed on to the mind. The mind has got a natural tendency to run after such worldly objects. The yogi withdraws the mind again and again from the objects of the senses and fixes it on the self and makes himself free from the disturbances of life.
Vishaya vinivartande niraharasya dehinah rasavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva divartade.
2.59 The objects of the senses fall away from the abstinent man, but not the taste for them. But even the taste falls away when the Supreme is seen. The sense objects reach out to only those who is badly in need of them and not to those who do not want them. Even then, the sense objects are capable of leaving their taste behind even in an abstinent seeker who may find it difficult to erase them completely from his mind. Sri Krishna says here that all such longings created even at the mental level because of ego will be made ineffective when the seeker transcends ego and comes to experience the self, attains wisdom. But the reverse, that is, with the disappearance of the taste the striver attains steadfast wisdom, is not true. Sri Krishna is explaining the difference between outer abstention and inner renunciation. We may reject the object, but the desire for it may remain. Even the desire is lost when the Supreme is seen. The control should be both at the body and mental levels. Liberation from the tyranny of the body is not enough. We must be liberated from the tyranny of desires also, which presupposes realization of the Supreme. Thus, in the restraint of the senses evinced by a man of realization, not only the sense objects turn away from him but also attachment itself with its roots vanish.
Yatato hyapi kaunteya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani pramadhini harandi prasabham manaha.
2.60 The turbulent senses, O son of Kunti, do violently carry away the mind even of a wise man, though he may be striving to control them. Sri Krishna has so far emphasized that a perfect master is the one who has a complete control over his sense cravings. Sense cravings are like turbulent horses. If these horses are kept under control, destination can be reached with safety, otherwise the rider gets thrown out. Even a man of discrimination falls prey to the temptations of the world. Therefore, the aspirant must not relax his effort for self-control. He should bring all the senses under his control, otherwise his mind will be dragged to the field of sense objects, leading to a sorrowful experience. This is more likely to happen even to a highly evolved seeker, whereby he will not be able to reach his spiritual destination of final liberation. This is an advice of caution to the seeker.
Tani sarvani samyamya yukta asida matparaha vasehi yasyendriyani tasya prajna pradishtida.
2.61 Having restrained all the senses, he should sit steadfast, intent on me, His wisdom is steady whose senses are under control. Sri Krishna warns Arjuna here that as a seeker of self-perfection he should control his mind by withdrawing all his sense organs from their wanderings and should concentrate his entire attention on me, that is, the Lord, the Supreme. The idea is that the mind should be made completely calm to meditate on Him, the Supreme Lord. Such a yogi, having brought under control all his senses, is called a person of steady wisdom and established in the self. Self-discipline is not a matter of intelligence. It is a matter of will of the mind and vision of the highest. This is a technique of self-development.
ध्यायतो विषयान् पुंस संगस्तेषूपजायते संगात् संजायते काम कामात् क्रोधोऽभिजायते.
2.62 When a man thinks of objects, attachment for them arises. From attachment desire is born, from desire arises anger.
क्रोधात् भवति सम्मोहः सम्मोहात् स्मृतिविभ्रमः स्मृतिभ्रंशात् बुद्धिनाशो बुद्धिनाशात् प्रणश्यति.
2.63 From anger comes delusion, from delusion the loss of memory, from the loss of memory the destruction of intelligence, from the destruction of intelligence he perishes. From here onwards Sri Krishna explains the theory of fall of man from godhood to sense entanglements. The source of all evils is wrong thinking and false perceptions. When a man constantly thinks upon the alluring features of the sense objects, the consistency of such thought creates an attachment in him for the objects of his thought. When similar thoughts come to play on his mind continuously, they become strong desire for possessing and enjoying the objects of attachment. He tries his level best to obtain them. When this motive energy encounters with forces creating obstacles in the way of fulfillment of his desires, it is called anger. He starts hating the people who come in the way of satisfying his wants, fights with them and develops hostility towards them. When a person is afflicted with anger, his mind gets confused, casting a shadow on the lessons of wisdom learnt by him through past experience. Thus deprived of the moral strength, he loses his power of discrimination between right and wrong, which is called destruction of intelligence. Failing in discrimination, he acts irrationally on the impulse of passions and emotions, and thereby he is unable to attain the spiritual goal, paving the way for self-destruction. Here Krishna traces moral degradation to those first breaths of thought that come softly and almost unconsciously to the mind. Desires may prove to be as rebellious and challenging as the most powerful external forces. They may lift us into glory or hurl us into disgrace. Kalidasa in Kumara Sambhavam says that they are really brave whose minds are not disturbed when the sources of disturbance are face to face with them. What is called for is not a forced isolation from the world or destruction of sense life, but an inward withdrawal. To hate the senses is as wrong as to love them. The horses of the senses are not to be unyoked from the chariot but controlled by the reins of the mind. The movement from desire to destruction can be illustrated as under: brooding on the objects of senses, attachment, desire, anger, delusion, loss of memory, loss of reason, utter ruin.
रागद्वेषवियुक्तैस्तु विषयानिन्द्रियैश्चरन् आत्मवश्यैर्विधेयात्मा प्रसादमधिगच्छति.
2.64 But the self-controlled man, moving among objects with his senses under restraint and free from both attraction and repulsion, attains peace. The mind and the senses are endowed with the two natural currents of attraction and repulsion, liking some objects and disliking certain others. But a man with mental discipline approaches these sense objects with a mind free from attraction or repulsion, thereby attaining the peace of the eternal. The senses and the mind are his servants but not the masters. He is the master of wisdom. Running away from the sense objects cannot ensure mental tranquility because mind's agitations forgetting the desired objects or to get rid of the undesired ones will continue. When the mind is trained in these two aspects, viz. A. To live in self-control and B. To move among the sense objects with neither attachment nor hatred towards them, its agitations caused by the charm of such objects are brought under control. This condition of the mind, which has the least sense disturbances because of the ineffectiveness of the sense objects upon it, is called tranquility or peace or prasada. This verse answers Arjuna's question as to how does the man of steady wisdom move about?
Prasade sarva dukkhanam hanirasyopačāyate prasanna cedaso khyāshu buddhi paryavadishthate.
2.65 In that serenity there is an end of all sorrow, for the intelligence of the man of serene mind soon becomes steady. What happens when peace is attained is explained here. Sri Krishna says that when mental peace is attained there is no hankering after sense objects. The yogi has perfect mastery over his reason and sense of discrimination. The intellect abides in the self. It is quite serene and steady. The miseries of the body and mind come to an end. Peaceful mind is a condition precedent for happiness. Peace is happiness, happiness is peace. The least agitated mind is the proof of absence of sorrows and sorrows are the proof of the state of mental disturbance. Destruction of sorrows or pain indicates the elimination of vasanas inasmuch as vasanas are the cause for delusion which creates all sorrows. Keeping the mind under tranquil atmosphere through a life of self-control is the secret for the elimination of vasanas.
Nasti buddhirayuktasya na ca-yuktasya bhavana na ca-bhavayatah shanti asandasya kutas sukham.
2.66 The man whose mind is not under his control has no self-knowledge, and to the unsteady no meditation is possible, and to the unmeditative there can be no peace, and to the man who has no peace how can there be any happiness? The necessity for the quietness of mind for practicing the technique of self-perfection is explained here. The unsteady mind cannot practice meditation. The mind which cannot be focused on meditation cannot acquire the knowledge of the self. Such a person will not have intense devotion and longing either to self-knowledge or to liberation. A person with these negative qualities cannot have peace of mind. How can a man who has no peace of mind enjoy happiness? Insatiable thirst for sense objects is the enemy of peace, and there cannot be even an iota of happiness for a man with no peace. His mind is always restless and runs after worldly objects. Only when this thirst dies down a man can enjoy a real and abiding peace, when he will be able to meditate and rest in the self. True happiness is not in the thirst for objects but in the restraint of the senses from thirst for enjoyment. Thirst is misery indeed.
Indriyanam hi charatam yanmano nu vidhiyate tadasya harati prajñam vayurnavamivamphasi.
2.67 When the mind runs after the wandering senses, it carries away his discrimination, as the wind carries away a boat on the waters. The mind which constantly thinks about the sense objects and moves only in pursuit of such objects destroys altogether the discriminatory faculty in man. Just as a gale carries away a rudderless ship from its charted course and drives her away from reaching its destination, so too the unsteady mind carries away the aspirant from his spiritual path and turns him towards the worldly objects by taking away his discrimination.
Tasmadyasya mahabaho nigrihidani sarvashaha indriyani indriyathebhya tasya prajñā pradhisthita.
2.68 Therefore, O mighty armed Arjuna, his wisdom is steady whose senses are completely restrained from their objects. The man of steady wisdom can, at his will, withdraw the senses from their objects and enter into communion with the self.
Ya disā sarva bhūtānaṁ tasyam jāgatti samyami yasyam jāgrati bhūtāni sā disā pasyato munehe.
2.69 In that which is night to all beings, the self-controlled man is awakened where all beings are awake, that is the night for the man who sees, has vision. To the ignorant the supreme reality is like the night. They see in it confusion and darkness. But the man of steady wisdom is fully awake with regard to reality. Again, the multiplicity of the world of time and space is as clear as a day to the ignorant. But the man of wisdom sees in it the confusion of a night. Ignorance creates is the idea of multiplicity and duty while the wise never deviates from the knowledge of the self. Error stands in the same relation to truth as sleeping to waking.
Abhujyamanamachala pradishtham samudramapa pravishandi yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishandi sarve sasandi mapnodi nakamakami.
2.70 He attains peace into whom all desires enter as the waters enter the ocean, which is full to the brim and grounded in stillness, but not the man who is the desirer of desires. Just as the ocean is not at all affected by the waters flowing into it from all sides, an enlightened person, who rests in his essential nature or self, is not in the least disturbed by desires produced by the objects of enjoyment which he happens to come across during his sojourn on earth. Such an individual who maintains true peace in spite of being a target for the stimuli conveyed through his sense organs by innumerable sense objects is called a man of perfection, a true saint. A man attains such a state through constant awareness of the unchangeable reality that constitutes his innermost self. He who looks outside for enjoyments never attains peace. The principle behind this phenomenon is that the insentient cannot satisfy the sentient can be satisfied by the sentient alone.
Vihaya kamanya sarvan umam saradi nisprihah nirmamo nirahangarah sachandi madhigacchadi.
2.71 That man attains peace who, abandoning all desires, moves about without longing, devoid of the sense of I-ness and the my-ness. This verse explains the mental condition of such a one who finds peace in himself. Such a sage renounces all desires and is without any longings or attachments. Affinity for the world exists only because of desires. If desires are given up, no affinity for the world remains. Such a person's intellect is without any sense of I-ness or my-ness, that is, without any ego which is the cause for the sense of attachment. All the sufferings in the world are caused by our egocentric misconception and consequent eruption of endless wants. He is a genuine sannyasin who leads a life of constant inspiration gained through an intelligent renunciation of his egocentric misconceptions. The well-known Upanishadic saying is the human mind is of two kinds, pure and impure. That which is intent on securing the desires is impure, that which is free from attachment to desires is pure. This verse answers Arjuna's question how a man of steadfast mind walks or what is his mode of conduct.
Yesha brahmi sthiti partha nainam prapya vimuhyati stitva syamanda kalepi brahma nirvana mricchati.
2.72 This is the Brahmi state, O son of Pritha. Attaining this, none is deluded. Being established therein, even at the hour of death, one attains final liberation in Brahman. Where ego ends and the individuality is completely wiped out, a state of selfhood, the state of Brahman, existence, knowledge, bliss absolute, Satchitananda, dawns. Renouncing everything and living in the self is the Brahmi state or the state of God-realized soul. If the aspirant attains this state, he never falls into delusion again, never again deluded by the world. It is the highest state of happiness. This experience needs to take place at an early age. But if it is attained even at the time of death, he attains liberation. Hence, what doubt can there be about liberation of a man who practices the discipline of renunciation from an early age and dwells on Brahman throughout life? Wisdom is the supreme means of liberation, but this wisdom is not exclusive of devotion to God and desireless work. Even while alive, the sage rests in Brahman and is released from the unrest of the world. The sage of steady wisdom lives a life of disinterested service. The descriptions of the ideal man, the jnani, the sthitaprajna, the yoga-rudder, the gunatita or the bhakta agree in all essentials. Working without attachment and desires, egoism and vanity, always equanimous with pairs of opposites, is to control the ego and experience the self. This technique of karma yoga is not different from the technique of meditation or knowledge or devotion. Such a sage of steady wisdom lives a life of disinterested action. But Arjuna remains confused, and so the Lord explains karma yoga further in the next chapter.
Om Tat Sat Iti Srimad Bhagavad Gītāsu Upanishadsu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre Sri Krishna Arjuna Samvade Saankhya Yogo Nama Dvitiyodhyayah.
Thus in the Upanishads of the glorious Bhagavad Gita, the science of the eternal, the scripture of yoga, the dialogue between Sri Krishna and Arjuna ends the second discourse entitled the Yoga of Knowledge. Arjuna's despondent condition, verses 110. Arjuna continues in his state of dejection. His personality is destroyed by his overwhelming emotions erupting at the sight of his near and dear ones on the battlefront. Assuming a false sense of renunciation, he argues that he would rather live on alms than slay noble elders like Bhishma and Drona, and that even an undisputed sovereignty over all the worlds would not drive away his grief. Arguing thus, he expresses his unwillingness to fight, and completely spent he becomes silent. Indestructibility of the embodied, verses 11 to 30. Krishna starts the sermon of the Gita by stating that the wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. The self within is eternal, indestructible. The bodies enveloping the self are ephemeral. They have a beginning and an end. Death is certain for the born and birth for the dead. Beings constantly pass through the repeated stages of unmanifest, manifest and again unmanifest. So I grieve over the inevitable. The indwelling self remains eternally the same. Your duty to act, verses 31 to 40. Krishna explains to Arjuna the importance of performing his duty. A Kshatriya, warrior, is fortunate to find an opportunity to fight a righteous battle. Abandoning such an opportunity will only incur infamy and sin. In victory, a Kshatriya enjoys sovereignty over the worlds. If slain in battle, he will gain heaven. Therefore, Krishna advises Arjuna to arise from his paralyzed state and fight the battle without concern for the results. The knowledge imparted up to verse 38 in this chapter is Saankhya. Thereafter Krishna turns towards karma yoga, the practice of which will eradicate the deepest fear in Arjuna. Desire-ridden actions, verses 41 to 44. Those who fanatically adhere to mechanical rituals are the irresolute whose desires dissipate their minds. They eulogize the ritualistic portion of the Vedas and declare in flowery speech that there is nothing beyond these rituals. Despite regular performance of the rituals, their attention in life remains focused on enjoying the pleasures and power in the world. Such people possess a vacillating mind, unable to concentrate and meditate on the Supreme Self. Desireless actions lead to self-realization. Verses 45 to 53. The Vedas deal with three gunas, sattva, rajas and tamas. They explain the process of evolution from tamas to rajas and from rajas to sattva. Krishna advises Arjuna to free himself from the endless pairs of opposites that plague this world and rise to the state of sattva. To free himself from the mania of acquiring and preserving and instead slowly merge with the self. An enlightened soul remains ever in supreme peace and bliss. In that state he will find even the Vedas as redundant to him as a pond would be in a flooded village. Krishna induces Arjuna to act steadfastly towards the goal of realization without worldly attachments and remain balanced in success or failure, and to keep the mind calm and composed while the body acts dynamically towards the higher ideal. The process of pursuing the supreme goal steadfastly with an equanimous mind is yoga. Continuing on the path of yoga, one sheds vasanas, desires, and the mind turns introvert. An introverted mind alone can meditate and realize the Supreme Self. Description of an enlightened soul, verses 54 to 72. Arjuna asks Krishna to describe the nature of enlightened soul. How would he express himself in the world? What happens to him internally? How does he contact the external world? The last 18 verses of this chapter give a brilliant exposition of a self-realized soul. Reveling in the bliss of the self, the enlightened one stays free from all egocentric attachments and desires. In the state of absolute fulfillment, all worldly enjoyments fall into insignificance. He is like a river which has entered the ocean. Having reached that supreme state, he has merged with eternity. Live as the Gita teaches you to live. Control of the senses and the mind is prescribed as a stepping stone to spiritual progress, as these faculties have a natural propensity to engage with objects. This underscores the fact that the spiritual quest involves directing the mind within by withdrawing it from objects. When the mind engages in the world, it is constantly subjected to attachment, likes and dislikes, and anger because the external factors are not under one's control. To realize one's true nature as the self, Atman, within, it is necessary to exercise control over the mind by restraining its tendency to do what it likes. If the mind is given the freedom to do what it wants, only constant restlessness would result as a result of desires that arise one after another. This prods the individual to action to fulfill his desires, giving rise to frustration and anger when they are not fulfilled. Even when he is able to realize his desires, the joy that he enjoys is fleeting, and thus the quest for worldly joy only subjects the person to further bondage by his actions. To become free from this quagmire, which traps man, is the objective of spiritual quest. The basic requirement then is disentanglement from the world slowly by restraining the mind. As long as an individual is subject to bondage, due to ignorance of his true spiritual nature, his identification will be with his body and his actions will be to preserve and pamper it, while a man of wisdom, jnani, will identify with the self and thus be free from attachment to his body. The equanimity of mind that a jnani has is a consequence of his constant abiding in the self, which is tranquil and blissful. The afflictions of his body will not disturb his mind as he is aware of their transience. The relationship between the body and the mind is an illusion created due to superimposition, a diasa, which is primordial. Just as the moon shines because of the sun's light, so also does the mind acquire the properties of the objects it engages with. When the mind attains union with the self, it reflects its serenity and bliss. Krishna's advice to Arjuna is to have equanimity of mind to achieve the ultimate objective. He says, "One who has control over the mind is tranquil in heat and cold, in pleasure and pain, in honor and dishonor, and is ever steadfast with the Supreme Self." This is in accordance with the saying in the Rig Veda, "The mind is fickle like a fast galloping horse, and the only way to control it is by involving it in good actions beneficial for the welfare of all." If a man can control his mind, he can find the way to enlightenment, and all wisdom and virtue will naturally come to him. The mind is like a white cloth. Dip it in red dye, it turns red; dip it in green, it turns green. Put it out in the sun for long, it loses its color. The mind is truly the self itself with no color. What we think determines what happens to us. So if we want to change our lives, we need to stretch our minds. The world is as the mind perceives it. The world is as the mind thinks of it. Manomatram jagat, manokalpatam jagat. If the Bhagavad Gita is viewed as a spiritual metaphor, the persons portrayed are ingenious depictions symbolizing the various stages in the transformation of spirit into matter. The battle proper represents the real struggle that ensues within a person who realizes that all along it was the mind and its deep-rooted tendencies that were playing a devious game of deception with him, leading to false perceptions of truth and happiness, and so, under proper guidance, sets out to rectify all this. Kurukshetra, the battlefield, refers to our own bodily domain, where the action must take place. Pandu was the rightful monarch of Bharata, the bodily kingdom. Pand in Sanskrit means white or pure, referring to the faculty of discriminating between right and wrong, which humans inherently possess. If man lives as per this discriminating power, he will live life in such a way that slowly but surely, the soul's body consciousness ascends to spirit consciousness, and thus one attains independence from false providers of happiness, namely, the five senses. As the story goes, Pandu has 5 sons representing the power of dispassion and the power of persisting therein. The bodily kingdom comes to be ruled by the blind king Dhritarashtra, who represents our own infatuated sense and hence blind mind. The blind king's eldest son Duryodhana represents vain, material desire, most difficult to fight off. His 99 other sons represent other sense-entrenched tendencies of the mind. The victory of Pandavas represents self-purification. Similarly, in day-to-day working life too, if one starts taking right action, his efforts will eventually lead to total realization of the self, the ultimate goal of life.
Srimad